As Canada's ties with the United States fray, Prime Minister Mark Carney moves to strengthen ties with Europe.
Canada-EU or EU-Canada strategic partnership for the future will build a new and deeper relationship that brings us closer together, from defense to digital.
The flow of one of America's most significant exports is being redirected by one of its most dependable allies. Aluminum, not gas, not oil. Canada was a major supplier of the metal used to construct vehicles, airplanes, buildings, and power grids for the United States for a large portion of the previous century. Over 4 out of 5 tons of Canadian aluminum occasionally found their way south of the border. That long-standing agreement appeared to unstoppable until 2025, when Canada started directing aluminum worth around $18 billion in Europe. Price and shipping channels ease weren't the only factors. Carbon was the deciding element. Canada's low-emission smelters became a goldmine for firms looking to avoid fines due to Europe's new climate regulations. What appeared to be a change in technical policy abruptly turned into a geopolitical one. Once thought of as a normal commodity, aluminum is now redefining who truly benefits from Canada's prosperity, testing long-standing ties, and rearranging alliances. Wondering? Stay to the very end. The aluminum industry in Canada was never designed with the home market in mind. Its scope has consistently exceeded the nation's capacity to consume it. More than 3 million tons of aluminum are produced annually by tens of thousands of smelters in British Columbia and Quebec, making up around 11% of all aluminum exports worldwide. The United States was a clear and obvious destination for that output for the majority of the history of modern trade. It was simple because of geography. Canadian smelters were immediately connected to American industrial centers by rail links and shipping routes. The market in America was huge. No other buyer came close in terms of convenience or scale, and political relations, though sometimes difficult, were largely stable. That dynamic formed the foundation of Canada's aluminum trade for many years. However, there was a hidden cost to the dependency. Whenever disagreements emerged between Washington and Ottawa, whether they were about softwood lumber, dairy imports, or more general aluminum, had a tendency to be caught in the crossfire of trade disputes. One of the most obvious reminders occurred in 2018, when Washington imposed a 10% tariff on Canadian aluminum on the grounds of national security. Although it was a short-term solution, it brought attention to a fact that could no longer be disregarded. Because of their heavy reliance on a single client, vital businesses were left vulnerable to the political the instant. This risk was controllable for many years. However, the advent of climate policy as a major influence on international trade has started to completely change the norms. The European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, lies at the heart of this change. Europe will impose carbon charges on specific imported goods starting in 2026. If other nations fall short of our standards or fail to go in the right direction, we can use a carbon border tax to level the playing field for European goods, including aluminum, based on the amount of carbon emissions emitted during manufacturing. This policy has a significant impact. One of the materials that requires the most energy to create worldwide is aluminum. Aluminum oxide is heated to extremely high temperatures during the procedure, until pure aluminum separates from it, a procedure that consumes enormous amounts of electricity. The carbon footprint is enormous in nations where coal or natural gas are the main sources of electricity generation. 1 ton of aluminum can produce up to 16 tons of carbon dioxide in places like China, India, and portions of the Middle East. Smelters in Canada operate nearly exclusively on hydropower in comparison. For every ton of aluminum produced, emissions are reduced to roughly 2.22 tons of CO2 thanks to this sustainable energy source. With emissions about 1/17 of the global average, Canadian aluminum is among the cleanest in the world. The distinction offers a clear financial benefit in addition to being a source of environmental pride. Coal under CBAM carbon tariffs of hundreds of dollars per ton may be imposed on dependent manufacturers exporting to Europe. The cost of the search may be more than $300, depending on the current price of carbon. But hydro-powered smelters in Canada are protected. Their aluminum can be sold in Europe for little or no more money, and it can often fetch a higher price. Seldom does sustainability translate into market dominance. In the context of 2025, this stark disparity has taken on even more significance as ties between Ottawa and Washington have once again soured. Beginning with a 25% levy in March and increasing to a 50% duty by June, the United States has increased its tariffs on Canadian aluminum. Together with these, a separate executive order released in July imposed a broad 35% duty on a variety of Canadian goods. In response, Ottawa imposed 25% levies on American aluminum and other targeted goods as part of its own retaliatory measures. The smooth aluminum commerce between neighbors, which had been a century-old custom, has become a political hostage situation. In light of this, Europe offers a completely new kind of possibility rather than just a different market. As CBAM approaches, Canada has the opportunity to shift from a defensive retaliatory stance to a proactive one. Canadian manufacturers can look to long-term European contracts that offer stability and higher returns, rather than battling to keep every cargo headed for the United States safe from erratic tariff threats. Presidential decree protects these agreements against sudden reversals. And consequently, the logic of the balance of trade is being reversed. Once the undisputed determinant of trade decisions, geography is increasingly challenged by adherence to environmental regulations. In certain situations, certain regulations are more important than the shipping price. Furthermore, in a world where the U.S. has shown that it is willing to use trade as a weapon at short notice, carbon policy turns into more than just an environmental safeguard. Geopolitical. Germany is a remarkable example of the ramifications of this change. In order to achieve its ambitious net zero goals, the nation is rebuilding its industrial roots. In that process, aluminum plays a key role in low-carbon building materials, renewable energy infrastructure, and lightweight automobiles. However, obtaining aluminum without significantly increasing carbon penalties have grown to be a huge problem. Russia used to be a significant provider, but sanctions have cut off that supply stream. Despite its abundance, China's aluminum has a high carbon footprint and geopolitical dangers that European consumers are becoming less willing to accept. Headline pricing is no longer the only factor taken into consideration by German procurement teams. After carbon penalties are included, they must now calculate the overall cost. Regardless of its initial cost, coal-powered aluminum becomes significantly more expensive under CBM. When carbon costs are taken into account, Canadian aluminum, which may initially cost a little more, becomes the more affordable choice. Climate policy has essentially changed the equation of global acquisition. The ramifications of this change are extensive. Environmental accounting is appending traditional economic ties based on location and cost. This is neither a symbolic decision or an issue of managing a green image for a nation like Germany. It concerns preserving industrial competitiveness in a time when carbon expenses are rising, an inevitable aspect of conducting business. And aluminum from Canada is in a unique position to close the deficit in that calculation. Canadian aluminum shipments to Germany had already started to increase substantially by the middle of 2025. In addition to German ports, the Netherlands, Poland, and Denmark were all receiving the first test cargo. Despite their small size, these early orders had a big impact on international trade. The foundation for multi-year supply contracts is frequently laid by cautious test shipments. The biggest manufacturers in Europe, such as Mercedes, BMW, and Volkswagen, can now include Canadian aluminum into their manufacturing without facing CBM fines. Their capacity to compete against competitors who face higher carbon costs is strengthened by this advantage, which also safeguards their supply chains. Canada is moving away from its long-standing automatic reliance on the United States with each ton of aluminum shipped to Europe. Once seemingly unbreakable, the North American trading relationship has become more erratic. European customers, on the other hand, are compelled by carbon policy to enter into long-term agreements that cannot be revoked at any time. This change represents more than a flow rerouting of aluminum. It represents a more profound shift in the fundamentals of international trade. Once viewed as a minor priority, environmental policy now plays a pivotal role in determining economic strategies and geopolitical alignments. The aluminum industry in Canada, which was established over many years to take advantage of hydroelectric resources, is now in a prime position to prosper under this new system. Dependency on a single market, which was historically a vulnerability, is changing. Becomes a chance for Europe to diversify, command greater prices, and establish more reliable alliances. More than just a consistent supply of aluminum is available in Canada. It offers a solution to achieve climate goals without compromising industrial power. Additionally, this shift means that the U.S. will no longer have control over a vital resource that it formerly took for granted. In the larger together, these changes demonstrate how emission reduction efforts are changing much more than energy systems or industrial emissions. They are redefining alliances, redrawing trade maps, and questioning the notion that the main factors influencing international markets are cost and location. Aluminum made on Canada's British Columbian beaches and Quebec valleys is today valued not just as a commodity, but also as a representation of how resource flows can be transformed into strategic tools through climate policy. Every shipment to Europe serves as a warning that when new regulations alter the fundamental economics, long-held beliefs in trade can be challenged. So, let's consider the bigger picture. Canadian aluminum exports to the European Union increased by almost 12% in the first half of 2025 over the previous year. On paper, that might not seem like much considering that fewer than 10% of Canada's total aluminum sales come from Europe. However, there is a much larger tale behind those numbers. In 2010, about 85% of Canada's aluminum was being imported into the US. That percentage had dropped below 70% by the middle of 2025 and was still falling. Changing Europe's share even slightly say from 3% to 6%, translates into hundreds of additional yearly income for Canadian producers in the millions. The explanation is straightforward. Nowadays, a ton of low-carbon aluminum costs $150 to $200 more, a value that is directly based on climate policy as opposed to conventional cost considerations. This change has ramifications for Washington that go well beyond trade balances. Aluminum is a useful material, substance that affects almost all important sectors. It serves as the framework for military vehicles, satellites, and power grids. However, for more than 10 years, American smelting capacity has been gradually declining, dropping by roughly 15% since 2015. The United States is now more reliant on imports than at any other time in its recent history as a result of this decrease. Rather than recent legislative actions have made it more difficult to reverse this vulnerability. The Trump administration reintroduced 25% Section 232 tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum in March 2025. These tariffs applied to semi-processed and derivative products as well as raw ingots. The tariff rate jumped to 50% 3 months later. The situation became even more unstable in August when a broad 35% tax was applied to the majority of Canadian exports that were not covered by the USMCA, including aluminum. The impact was obvious. Once freely flowing across the border, the resource was now used as a political negotiating chip. And that insight was more profound than any brief shipment holdup. The lesson was obvious for Canada. Because the sector was so dependent on a single client, it was susceptible to changes in political sentiment. Diversification ceased to be an abstract objective and became a type of trade insurance. An early warning that commerce could be armed overnight was provided by the tariff fear of 2018. With the development of Europe's CBM framework, aluminum manufacturers at last had a realistic and more profitable alternative. This had nothing to do with changing backup markets. It aimed to increase resilience by gaining access to long-term European contracts that are protected against abrupt changes in Washington policy. The structural benefit included into climate policy is what makes the European approach particularly alluring. The way heavy industries compete will be drastically altered by the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is expected to be fully implemented by 2026. The new regulations require businesses that export energy-intensive emissions from production must be taken into consideration when importing goods into Europe. The effect on aluminum is striking. Carbon levies for coal-based smelters in nations like China, India, and the Gulf states may surpass $300 per ton. Hydro-powered smelters in Canada, on the other hand, are almost impervious. By slipping past those expenses and frequently selling at a premium, their output transforms sustainability into immediate economic power. What are your thoughts? Leave a comment with your ideas. Additionally,